got the participant list going up at the moment. We just might wait another minute or so just to see if more participants attend. It is going up as we speak. So I'll just wait another minute or so and then we'll get started. For the benefit of those who just attended, we're just waiting another minute. There's a couple of participants who have registered who've yet logged on, so we'll be starting shortly. Okay, everyone, I think we're pretty much there. Afternoon and welcome to everybody to our third of 3 webinars today. With this afternoon, we're going to be talking about introduction to point of care testing following our 2 sessions this morning, which were related to the various stages in the accreditation process and also the requirements of 15189 and 17025. This afternoon's session is going to be a mixture between myself, section head for healthcare, and John Ringrow, senior assessment manager in the healthcare section. So I just wanted to start off with just a definition of what point of care testing actually is and what we're talking about in this session when we refer to this. This is the commonly accepted definition of point of care testing, which is the analytical patient testing activities provided within an institution, wherever that may be, but within the responsibility of the accredited entity, but performed outside the physical facilities of a clinical laboratory. It doesn't require permanent dedicated space, but instead includes kits and instruments which are either hand carried or transported to the vicinity of the patient for immediate testing at that site. So ultimately what we're talking about, the 22870 definition would be testing that is performed near or at the site of a patient with the result leading to possible change in the care of the patient. Worthwhile pointing out that we talked earlier, for those who were listening to the previous sessions on ISO 15189, that 22870 can only be assessed in conjunction with ISO 15189. 15189 is currently undergoing a revision and will be published in 2 years' time, where the requirements of point of care testing will be included within it. For the time being, that's just for information. The important thing is to consider what the requirements of ISO 22870 and 15189 actually are. So ISO 22870 and 15189 references. There's a link at the moment with 15189. 22870 is not a standalone standard. For those of you who attended this morning's webinars, there's a question around this. 22870 is additional requirements over and above 15189. You are accredited to 15189, which is why if you are looking to introduce point of care testing, even if you're just doing sample collection at the moment, I recommend that you apply for ISO 15189 accreditation, because it will be easier to bolt on 22870 later. The main standard for accreditation is ISO 15189, and 22870 will be referred to in the schedule, not the certificate. So ISO 22870 is the additional standard intended for use by providers that wish to include point of care testing within their accredited scope. Specific additional requirements to the quality of competence of point of care testing. The international standard gives specific requirements applicable to point of care testing and is intended to be used in conjunction with 15189. That summarizes the points. So you're accredited to 15189, 22870 gives additional requirements for you as a point of care testing provider. And what does that mean? Well, let's talk about the point of care testing provider, whether a laboratory, whether a legal entity, however you call them, the point of care testing provider is the key phrase. Because operators potentially might not be employed by the applicant entity or department, that's fine. Contract between applicant entity and department and owners of delivery points is critical. I think John will go into what we mean by delivery points later on, and should be requested prior to the assessment review. We need to understand what happens if there's a mistake, who's liable, because there may be a chain, particularly in this particular service provision. And operators and others need to follow and be trained in point of care testing providers, policies and procedures. So what are the requirements of point of care and of 22870? I'm going to pass over to John now, who's going to take you through those requirements and pick up from the next slide. John.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Hopefully you can see me if I press the right button. I should be talking now and a few more specific aspects of point of care testing and the standard, and picking out a few highlights that we need to make you more aware of or point towards when you are getting a copy of 22870 to read through, to have a look at, and to think about if you're having to do a gap analysis. So the management and the groups, they're quite critical for point of care, that these are appropriate groups that are set up. So the standard clause for that, 4.1.2.1, is refers to a health professional grouping, which could be a medical advisory committee, and they shall be responsible to the governing body for defining the scope of point of care to be made available. It also takes into consideration the clinical need for point of care, financial implications, technical feasibility, and the ability of the organisation to fulfil the need. So there's quite a lot of information that needs to be considered by this particular group. So it's a key group that needs to be set up. We would be looking at who is actually responsible for the group, how any of the feedback is fed back into that particular group. If there are any conflicts of interest or potential conflicts of interest, because there sometimes needs to be some independence in that group, especially in discussing things in setting up point of care services to start with. The competition, the composition and the competence of that group, and the background of the people involved. Now that would depend on the scope of activity for point of care in the first place, but we would expect to find some representation and reasonable input into the relevant areas of point of care scope. Also, how effective is this particular group, how it actually operates, and the construct, how it actually works. Are there any terms of reference set up, which we would expect to find with any group or committee that is working on this. Next slide, please. So when we're talking about management and groups, we look at the groups, the responsibility and the relevance to the particular clauses. So relevant core clauses coming out of this, we would highlight you to certainly to 4.1.2.3, 4, 5, 4.14. There's a variety of different clauses within 22870. But when you're looking at this, always remember to have 15189 alongside of this, because as we've said in the other webinars this morning, that there is always that connection between 22870 and 15189, and there are clauses in 22870 that reference and expect that there is the need to meet the requirements of 15189 as well. So for communication and roles responsibility, this may include personnel who may not be directly employed by yourselves as the applicants. It's important as well that the group is involved in evaluation of point of care devices, potential introduction of new devices. So there's definite input into that to make sure that you've got the appropriate equipment, the right equipment that is appropriate for the use for your service. It does refer to 15189 clauses as well. It's a very critical group, and it's the responsibility of the accredited provider. Although you could actually refer to other groups that are already established by another department or entity, but we would have that discussion with you to find out exactly how this works in your particular organisation. As I've said before, the management group will assist in evaluating and selecting point of care devices and systems, in defining any poor performance criteria for point of care devices. So when you're thinking about trueness, precision, detection limits, there would be input and some steer from this group to make sure that the right equipment and the appropriate equipment was being used. And also if you're thinking about introducing any new products or systems for point of care, that's important as well, that the group has kind of a steer into this, just to make sure that the right equipment is present. And also, we would expect some input from this management group and input feeding in from internal audits, because the management group is then learning, it's part of the quality management system and feeding back into the overall feedback loop as we've mentioned this morning. Next slide, please. So with the managements and groups then, there would be a director or somebody with delegated responsibility together with the management group would be responsible for the review of all of the quality assurance results and the performance. So we need to assess the effectiveness of how this is accomplished, the people involved, any of the feedback, the action, the records that come out of this. Because all of that feedback is important to the operation of the management group and overall to the management of point of care. We also look at the allocation of responsibilities and any designated staff undertaking point of care. That allocation of duties and responsibilities of different groups, it shall be defined within the operating procedures. So if you have the documentation to underpin this and how your group works, then the individual responsibilities of the various people within these groups will also be designated as well. So when we talk about laboratory director or designated person, we're referring to specifically 5.6.6 as one of the clauses for point of care. They will receive review external data or internal quality assessment data. And if any modifications are arising from that or any queries or issues that come out of that, it's how they actually feed back that into the system, into the overall quality management system to make sure that the whole service and the whole operation is operating in the most effective way, and it actually adds value to the whole process. Okay, next slide, please. So one of the key aspects of any point of care service is the personnel, and in any organization, in any operation, you would expect that personnel are key to the way that operates. So we look at how certain responsibilities are undertaken under that management group, and the particular clause there, 5.1.4, it does include reference to a training manager, but that requirement is actually quite vague. The word may is used there in that aspect. Now, if you as a provider don't have a training manager, then you'd have to justify this, or how you actually get around that, how you actually come across, how you actually manage training within your organization. So the requirements still have to be met there. So what we would need to be looking for is who or what entity is ultimately responsible for defining somebody as competent at performing point of care, and also how, by way of evidence, would a point of care provider demonstrate this. So provider sets the competence criteria. They may train coordinators or cascade trainers. they may periodically have to reevaluate that to make sure that that training is being carried out in an appropriate way. Also, we may see different records in place, but they have to be reviewed to make sure that things are suitable, and there has to be reference to objective evidence for competence by the provider. So thinking about these things and talking about record keeping this morning, all of this will be fed back into your record keeping processes and possibly into your internal audit processes as well. So with personnel, there are some key points out of that. Next slide, please. So you would have a point of care coordinator. They would generally have operator training responsibilities, but they may not necessarily be directly employed by the provider. We find quite commonly examples of this where, especially in a hospital situation, if there's a point of care service in operation, there may be new pieces of kit, a new glucose meter that comes along, a new urine analysis meter, blood gases. They're provided by a particular manufacturer, and that manufacturer may be providing some of the training directly for the users of those pieces of kit. However, it's still the responsibility of that overall point of care group and the provider to be very aware of and really directing what kind of training is required to make sure that the needs of that particular organisation is met in terms of training and in terms of maintaining competence. So there has to be some kind of responsibility and an input from the point of care coordinator or from whoever is managing the training to make sure that that takes place. The programme has to be carefully assessed, and it has to be to the required depth to make sure that there's no drift in competence due to the cascade of training. Sometimes that does happen. You might get a higher level core training that gets cascaded down through the organisation to various individuals, and sometimes the message can get diluted along the way. So this is the importance of records as well, and making sure that there are defined criteria for the training, so everyone knows what they're doing and when, and what they're delivering to people, and making sure that it's a uniform training package. Records, CPD, they are the responsibility of the provider, the point of care provider, and in assessment terms, we would be expecting to have evidence or see evidence that that is actually in place. Next slide, please. So if you're thinking of applying for point of care, main question we need to consider in applying is actually who's responsible for the results issued and their validity. And what is the role of the department, the provider, the entity under assessment with responsibility to the point of care. So that question would come out of a gap analysis. It would probably come out of a pre-assessment, and it would come out of the discussions if we've gone through to phase 2, out of the initial discussions with yourselves and ourselves, so that we've actually got that identified. We do need to actually make sure that the provider actually takes responsibility for those results. So what's going to be reviewed during a pre-assessment? So we might look for user information. There may be user manuals, there may be organisation charts, there may be service level agreements, evidence of inclusion into the quality management system, awareness of staff even, for the coordinators, the operators, key staff that may be interviewed during that process, just to get an overview, to get a feel for the general responsibility, and to make sure that the point of care is actually the responsibility of that legal entity. There's also some responsibilities for quality management staff, that they have responsibilities which also extend to point of care. If you're looking at 15189, there is the requirement for a quality manager. So it goes without saying then that would carry through, and that quality manager would then have responsibility for 22870 and for point of care as well within the quality management system. So there are some links on these slides, actually, where those points were highlighted. There will be some links to relevant areas of the UKAS website where a lot of information can be found. We talked about the application process this morning. If you visit the UKAS website, that will take you through those things. And also there is a generic area on the UKAS website which details the generic route to accreditation, which takes you through all of the phases, assuming now that we are down to the level of progressing with accreditation. Next slide, please. So with the applications, we've established the groups, the management, the personnel. We've got a good understanding of how you as a provider operate as a service. There is some further information on the service that is required. So we will be looking for the following in the application, or we need to discuss with you first of all, to determine the approach to the assessment for point of care. So we need to know where it's actually delivered. It might be the clinics, outlets or shops, etc. We would need to understand the technical scope of the point of care, and that generally will come from the application form. We need to understand what information technology systems that you use and how you are getting those reports out to the appropriate persons. We would need to understand what tests or what platforms are being used, the workload and the activity, because that would govern then the actual sampling process that we would use later on when we actually come to do an assessment. If it's a very large operation, you may have a number of coordinators. You may be operating on a number of different sites. And again, that would govern how we would actually sample that. Also the number of trained point of care operators, their roles and functions. If there's a large organization or you're delivering to various different sites, you may have different operators doing different parts of the point of care operation. Possibly this is more limited for COVID, but certainly within a hospital environment, we would find a variety of different people who may be trained in different functions. For instance, there may be healthcare staff, there may be nursing staff, there may be healthcare assistants, or there may be other operators that deal with point of care. Next slide, please. Okay, so there's a relevance to this particular slide. It's another number that you won't have possibly come across before, another ISO standard, 17011. And this is one of the standards that all accrediting bodies have to abide by themselves. So ourselves sitting in the world of accreditation, there is a standard for accrediting bodies. And one of the parts of this particular standard requires for sampling. So the procedure shall ensure, that is the accrediting body's procedure, shall ensure that the performance of a sample of the conformity assessment activities representative, the assessment shall cover a sample of locations and personnel. So that is dictating that ourselves as an accrediting body are required to actually sample all of the key elements of a particular provider's service in order to provide the rigor and to provide the appropriate depth and breadth of assessment. Also, we as the accreditation body shall consider the risk associated with the activities, the locations, the personnel covered by the scope. So what that actually means is that there may be some different risks associated with different parts of your point of care service. That might be the particular location that you're delivering this service. It might be risks associated with the different groups of staff. It might be to do with the actual processes themselves. So there are things that we need to consider when we're actually deciding what areas we're going to be sampling. And also finally, there's 7.4.7, the accreditation body shall develop an assessment plan to cover the activities to be assessed. So that would include the locations, the personnel, the assessment techniques, and including whether or not we are witnessing any of these things. Now, we do have some flexibility as how we can design the structure of assessments and how we can sample to ensure that all aspects of the service are covered. And that we would be discussing with you during the pre-assessment processes, which for point of care, we would generally recommend a pre-assessment because it gives a greater understanding from both sides as to how that operates. Next slide, please. So UKAS assessment consistency. So assessments planned and delivered, they're exactly as for any other UKAS assessment, and we've got documented procedures to meet our accreditation requirements and to ensure that there's parity between various different types of customer. So we would have pre-visit activity there, which would be documentation review. It would be talking to yourselves as the customer. We would possibly have pre-assessment. Then there would be the actual assessment activity itself. So we would provide an assessment plan, a timetable for the assessment. We would try to stick to that timetable as closely as possible we can. You will know what activities that we are going to be assessing and witnessing. And then there's post-assessment activity as well. So after the assessment has taken place, if there are any non-conformities, any findings that have been raised and improvement actions that need to be dealt with, the improvement actions would be agreed at the time. And without going into too much detail on those sorts of processes with the assessment, you can find that information out on the UKAS website. We would issue with a report, an improvement action report and a recommendation. We would then later on assess a full issue you with a full report afterwards, and expect then to have evidence to clear any findings that are raised. So that is the general assessment process for any type of UKAS assessment. It's exactly the same as you would expect from any other assessing body. Next slide, please. So preparation for assessment, it might seem a rather obvious statement, read and interpret both standards. Reading the standard may seem obvious, but we do still go into quite a lot of customers' locations where many key staff still do not have much knowledge at all of the standards of the QMS and the associated policies and procedures. So that's kind of part of your preparation for things that you would expect. We would be expecting you to have some knowledge of the standard. We've talked about the gap analysis this morning. That is quite an important area, and there's a lot of use that you will gain from doing the gap analysis as well, and to point you in the right direction. Where you find the gaps that need plugging, then you can concentrate some more of your efforts on those, and that will help the rest of the process go smoothly. We would expect to review quality documentation, which you would be submitting to ourselves. Some of it you may have submitted along with the application form itself, and some of that we may have seen, but there is other documentation that we may ask during the process. We would expect that there is some staff familiarity with things, and that's where you come in from attending webinars to gain information from us, as you are doing now, and also reading around the websites, the various websites, the DHSC website, the UKAS website, to gain familiarity with the whole process. And also making sure that you have defined roles and responsibilities for point of care. Referring to some of the other UKAS documents that are around that you will be able to find on the UKAS website, that will give you further information on that. Next slide, please. So what are we looking for? We're obviously looking for conformance with both standards. We are looking for competence of the organisation, the provider, and the staff to manage point of care testing. And we're also looking for sufficient control and assurance processes to actually manage the risks behind all of that. Now, all of those things will actually come out of the various assessment tools that we use, those from document review, from interviewing staff, from sharing the screens, perhaps looking at live information, live data, and for you providing us with data, with evidence, if you're responding to findings, providing us that evidence as well. So that all of that gives us assurance then that you have a good idea, you have a good control of all of your quality assurance processes, and you know where the risks are, you're able to manage them, you're able to feed them back into your overall quality management system. Okay, next slide, please. So there are some common ISO 22870 issues for consideration. And this is generally from some of the experiences that we've had of assessing other point of care providers already, and some of the key things that we notice. The first of those is around reagents and consumables, and management of stocks, management of supplies. One of the other things that's quite important is environmental monitoring. If you are storing reagents, you're storing consumables, is how those things are stored. Are they stored in the appropriate conditions? Do you have any acceptance testing and batch-to-batch variation? How do you manage batch-to-batch variation? Because sometimes that can take place. So there needs to be some kind of processes in place that enable you to manage that. And do you have any control over any of the authorized suppliers of some of these things as well? So another area is that's quite important is around examination processes. And one of the things with the examination process, there's a number of key elements of this that can come out of this. It could be linked to the equipment, it could be linked to the actual process, it could be linked to the conduct of the particular test itself. If you're transporting any point of care equipment to the point of use, making sure that there are appropriate pre-use checks to make sure it's not been damaged in the transport. Could it be used by others who are not authorized for any reason? That's quite an important point, and it goes to the general training, the competence of your staff and who are actually doing the point of care. Are you using the appropriately authorized and competent staff? And there are various ways of doing that. It can also be linked into either manual record keeping, it can be linked into some kind of IT systems. We find commonly that if you have connectivity with devices, sometimes where you're actually managing this, you can lock people out if they say their competence has expired. Until they renew their competence, they can't use that piece of equipment anymore. So there are various things that can be considered around this. With accommodation environment as well, there's local issues around the location of where you do the point of care itself, where the environmental conditions appropriate for point of care testing. For this, if you're actually participating or you're doing the point of care delivery itself, manipulating the test processes, do you have the appropriate environment so that won't affect the results? If you're actually collecting the specimen, do you have the appropriate training, the appropriate facilities for doing that? For assurance, for test assurance, there needs to be a very good handle on the internal quality control and external quality control, external quality assurance processes. That can be quite a challenge for some point of care providers in making sure that that works properly, how that is set up, how you actually manage delivery of appropriate internal quality control test materials, how you deliver external quality assurance test materials to the point of operation, and that all of the operators are involved in that, they're engaged with that. Does IQC challenge the critical decision values? So are you using IQC across the full range of the test results? So that would be the full spectrum of results, from the positives, the equivalents to the negatives. So you're actually challenging things across the full range. Post-examination processes are reporting what results are given to whom and by whom, and where do those results go. Also, how do you deal with any erroneous results? Have you got the processes in place to deal with those things? And for all of these processes, there needs to be an audit trail really from the operator all the way back to the actual provider. So all of that would be encompassed within the assessment itself. Also, we would consider the IT systems. They need to be assessed in context, though, because not every provider would have a fully integrated information system. They may have manual processes, and we need to consider that. There's lots of, every provider deals with things in a way that is most appropriate to them, and we have to take cognizance of that when we assess. Okay, next slide, please. So there is other help out there. There's information around on some of the other websites, not just the UKAS website, because there are sources around in the greater community, or the more worldwide in the European community, for accreditation. So this is the website for the European accreditation there, and of which UKAS is a member. Also, there is ILAC, the International Laboratory Accreditation Corporation. Their publications will provide a lot of guidance, and also the International Accreditation Forum as well. So there are some links to these from the UKAS website to there, or you can go straight into those for further information. Okay, last slide, please. So finally, to sum up, we hope that's been an introduction to point of care. It's an area that people find a little bit more difficult, or a little bit more hesitant to become involved with. And sometimes we say, especially for laboratory providers of point of care, the idea is to start small and work your way up to add on to things. But one of the other key messages around point of care is the fact that you do have to consider 15189 as well as 22870. There's obviously benefits to accreditation. Accreditation can highlight gaps in capability. It provides the opportunity to provide organizational efficiency and outputs. It's an alternative to regulation, and it gives choices to commissioners of services as well, because in selecting an accredited service, there is then that guarantee of assurance that there is accreditation, that you meet a certain level of standards, and also the fact that accreditation is to an internationally recognized standard as well. Okay, thank you very much for listening, everyone. We can take some questions now.
Thanks, John. Thanks very much for that. Just also worthwhile perhaps saying that we'll probably be developing some more point of care testing webinars in the new year, as well as to go into that in a little bit more detail when providers have got used to the regulations and the international standard requirements as well. John, I'm just going to read a couple of questions that have come through, if that's all right. One from Jane Ogilvie. We believe we meet the requirements and our due diligence is thorough. Are you looking at CE marking of sampling kits? Many currently used are not CE marked. Additionally, are you assessing the actual PCR test meets the TTR criteria? For consistency, at what stage do the intended use statements and validation have to meet the requirements? Some of the TTR suppliers listed today do not appear to meet these currently. We need to understand the requirements time for meeting these standards. I think this probably relates more to the TTR regs, John, so I'll pick this up if that's all right.
Okay.
What we're looking at the moment, Jane, is we mentioned in this morning's sessions, is a provider self-declaring on their submission to DHSC, which comes through to us. We provide feedback on that, self-declaring that the product is CE marked, that's a minimum standard requirement, and that they meet certain criteria in terms of the TTR performance characteristics that are required. Now, I'm very happy if you'd like to feed through to me separately if you believe some of the TTR suppliers don't meet those standards currently. They're self-declared that validation does, and that they're verified that the system's in place and that the performance characteristics meet that. So that's with regards to the PCR, and as is generally speaking lab-based so far. So yes, we are looking at those things. Obviously, we've not had an in-depth assessment. All the organisations that have self-declared and have been published on the DHSC website will now proceed to stage 2 UKAS appraisal, where we'll be looking at these things in more details. So if you've got any concerns, please send them through to me separately at covid@ukas.com and I'll pick those up. And so please do feedback to us. I'm just looking to make sure I've answered all of your questions there. Do statements of have to meet the requirements? Some of the TTR spiders, we need to understand the requirements time frame for meeting these standards. The requirements time frame, James, to finish off, is that to meet TTR requirements from now on, organisations need to have, providers need to have submitted their self-declaration, and that needs to have been approved by UKAS in order to be on the published DH list. Within 4 weeks, they need to have met stage 2 UKAS appraisal stage, and organisations, providers need to be accredited by the end of June 2021. Okay, I hope that answers all of the questions there. Charita, are there any upcoming training courses for implementation? Well, I've been talking to the training team, and John will probably be introducing more webinars in the new year, and remote training as well. We're looking at introducing that, yes, Charita. I'd say that's probably a watch this space, but I'm sure the sales team and marketing team will have everybody's details. So if and when we will be developing something, and we'll communicate that out early in the new year. John, there was a question there for training as part of a comprehensive package. Are you happy this may have been delivered remotely, e.g. video, online training module, or say for finger prick or swab tests? Would this need to have been practical training? Can you pick that one up?
Yes, I can pick that one up. Yeah, the UKAS doesn't have any specified requirements for how you would actually deliver that training. What I would say though is you have to be satisfied yourself if that's the way, the method, or if that's the way that you choose to deliver training, video online training modules. You would have to be assured that the people coming out of that training are competent to do that particular job, and you would need to find some way of actually recording that. How would you actually assure yourselves without actually seeing them do the particular test, or rather watching them doing it online? I would think very carefully about how you actually reassure yourselves of doing that. UKAS doesn't have a specific way of requirements for you to say, yeah, you have to do this by face-to-face testing, face-to-face training, but that's up to you. But we would need to find some. We would need to see some evidence that you've actually considered the competence of the individual after that training.
Thanks, John. Thanks very much. I'm just going to go back to the top. John, John Gunn, if we are doing point of care testing only, do we still have to go through the full accreditation process as for PCR and lab? Well, it depends if this point of care testing is being done commercially. The requirements will be, as of today, of course, for test release, although that tends to be more PCR related, though there can be rapid tests that meet the requirements. Going forward for commercial testing beyond 31st of December 2020, it's likely that the commercial providers, commercial provision of COVID-19 testing, the point of care testing will need to be accredited, yes. And that process is the same but different to PCR and laboratory. We will devise an assessment approach that is appropriate for the scope of an organisation doing point of care testing as opposed to one doing laboratory. So yes, accreditation is still required, and the time frame is still June 2021. But the UKAS stage 2 UKAS appraisal stage is designed to ensure that there are appropriate stepping stones there to steadily move towards accreditation, make sure that's done in a manageable way. Your question moves into Wilbur McDonald's underneath, which is, are you best to do 2287 at the same time as 15189? Could be a lot to sort in 4 weeks. Please bear in mind, there is no requirement to absolutely meet all these requirements in 4 weeks. The requirement in 4 weeks is to meet stage 2 UKAS appraisal. You will have been required to download the various ISO documents, 15189 and 22870, if you want to become accredited to these standards for point of care testing. You will need to meet the 13 requirements that are listed on the UKAS website, one of which is to do a gap analysis with those 2 standards, and to have a plan going forward to ensure that you meet those requirements in time for an initial assessment before the June 2021 target accreditation date. So yes, there's work to do there, but it's not a case that it all has to be done in 4 weeks. Joseph, you said, do you believe the accreditation processes are frightening to newcomers? What one nice encouragement can you give to build confidence in pursuing accreditation? Tell you what, I'll have a go at this, John, and then perhaps you can too.
Okay.
Because I absolutely understand why the accreditation process is frightening to newcomers. I'm really pleased you asked the question, Joseph, because this is why we've done the webinars. And this is why we'll continue to do the webinars. This is why we've introduced the stage 2 UKAS appraisal process to try and help organisations move through the accreditation process without difficulty. We understand completely that it seems a lot to take on, and we're here to help you. And communication is key in that process. But what nice bit of encouragement can I give to build confidence in pursuing accreditation? Well, one thing I always think, and I've always said to the applicants, is that it gets easier. It gets easier as time goes by, because it sounds like, looks like such a soundbite if I say it out loud, but the process of continual improvement really does feed the management system. And it gets easier and easier to introduce improvements, that the management system starts to work for itself, and you will see the benefits. It will be difficult than the next few months, but we're here to help you. Your assessment manager's there to help you, but it really will benefit you, and you will see the benefit going forward. John, you're going to tell me I've stolen your idea now?
No,
be different.
No, you've given me some thinking time there. I can come back to this by one of the underpinnings ethos is the raison d'etre for UKAS, really, is that anything that can be accredited is. And we do that by communication, cooperation, collaboration. So the 3 C's there. And that kind of underpins a lot of our core values that all of our staff operate to. So one of the key things I would say that would go along with Ben's comments is the assessment managers are there to help you. We are there to help you to gain accreditation. The assessment managers will be very open to communicate with you. They'll be very open to discuss with you. They want to understand how your organisation works and how we can make the accreditation process work with you to achieve the ultimate aim. Well, we're quite friendly. We don't bite. So just engage with the assessment managers. And as Ben says, yeah, as you get into the process and you start to go through the accreditation process, the cycle, it does get easier because you get more familiar with it. You're gaining all of the understanding of what's required. You're building up your repository of documentation. You're improving through your own quality management system improvement processes. You're improving that yourself. So it does get easier.
Thanks very much, John. That's a good one. Jane, you just asked one last question. Could you provide the email address again, to contact you regards TT. I'm going to write it into the chat box. It's covid@ukas.com. If that's useful to anyone, so fairly easy to remember, but I've posted that. I'm not sure whether it will appear to you, but for anybody who needs that, it's covid@ukas.com, and we'll look to respond to your queries as quickly as possible. There are no other questions. No problem, Joseph. Joseph just thanks us for that. I just want to just give a quick summary in the absence of any questions. I'm not going to fill the last 10 minutes necessarily. I know we're all busy people. But just to reiterate a couple of key things that come out of that. I know it's a whistle-stop tour of point of care testing. I think the intention going forward is that we focus on this in the new year a little bit more. We provide the guidance for providers so that they know what requirements are and they know how to move forward with their accreditation application. So that will be coming out. We will ensure that you're all kept informed of that going forward. The other thing to bear in mind is to keep an eye out for the frequently asked questions that we will shortly be issuing. I have already 9 pages of frequently asked questions that we need to publish on our website. I think there'll be a few more from today. That should be a good port of call for various pieces of information to solve immediate questions. So just to thank you for your attendance this afternoon. We are here to help. If you do have any queries, please do so to tell us in covid@ukas.com. We will respond to your queries wherever we can, and we'll respond to those quickly. So please do send those in. All that's left for me to say is to thank you again for your attendance. If you've attended all 3, thanks for your patience. Your feedback will be greatly appreciated too. But other than that, I just want to thank you again and say all the very best and have a good rest of the day. Thanks. Goodbye.